Hello, everybody. Again, we are going perfectly on time. Now we are again together with the last session of our symposium. In this symposium, we'll welcome Merve Bedir and Marie-Lo Adams, connecting from Rotterdam and Boston. Thank you for your contribution. I would like to first introduce Merve Bedir to the audience shortly. Then we will discuss the presentations together with the questions received from yourself. So Merve Bedir is an architect and researcher based in Rotterdam. Her ongoing research examines infrastructures of hospitality and mobility. A second line of research follows the human and non-human relationships in the context of ecology and cybernetics. She's the founder of a formal academy, an experimental school program in Pearl River Delta region. Merve Bedir holds a PhD from Delft University of Technology, and she's an adjunct assistant professor at Hong Kong University. So also she led the team in Pearl River Delta region for automated landscapes, a research initiative by the Rotterdam-based Het Nieuw Institute. So I think she will share the outcomes of that research with us. Floor is yours, Merve. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Okay, today, first of all, can everyone hear me well? Because I'm actually connecting from a very terrible space. Okay, good. I will try to be as efficient and as fast at the same time as possible, and I will try to present both research and a design studio at the same time. I mean, consecutively, sorry. And the idea is to basically tell a little bit about the research that we conducted for the New Institute, at the New Institute, and also and then to kind of continue with the design studio that I led at Hong Kong University for 3 consecutive years. Yeah, I mean, first of all, again, thank you so much, Olgu, for inviting me for this presentation. And Nina has been a big, every piece she wrote was in our reading list for the studio. So I'm also glad to share the space with her. And also thanks to Aura for hosting this symposium. So with that, I'll just go on. So basically, I'll try to spare 10 minutes for the research part and 10 minutes for the design studio part. And the research from Het Nieuw Institute actually didn't necessarily start with the research on Pearl River Delta region. It was very much about Rotterdam from the Netherlands, about the Netherlands itself. So one of the let's say, the inspirations for starting this research topic, automated landscapes, was, let's say, the developments in the last decade, especially in relation to automation of work and production that is foreseen, for instance, seen mostly in the container terminal of Rotterdam Harbor, the new container terminal, which is almost fully automated, quote unquote, and then also in greenhouses, such as like the fully automated greenhouses, especially in the region of Westland in the Netherlands. So that was the first inspiration. And then the second inspiration, I think, comes actually from this Dutch artist, Constant Nieuwenhuis, who lived, I mean, his most prominent work came out in the 70s, where he, mostly talking about, referring to here to New Babylon, where basically Constant imagines a future where people won't have to work because robots will be doing all the work, and humans will have the free time to themselves where they can actually all become architects. So this is literally a quote from him. So maybe this is interesting for discussion later on. And here in the example of Rotterdam Port, the container terminal that's, as I said, almost fully automated. This was the initiating part of the research from Rotterdam side. And what they did was, because the Rotterdam Port is very hard to access, not necessarily because of its conditions of reaching to it, but also in terms of the ambition to actually keep humans away from work, away from machines. So this is like an agenda from the port itself. So without having proper access to the container terminal, this kind of opaque space, by all means, the research team basically started collecting all kinds of documents from different places to research and document the space. So patent documents, but anything public, that's news reports, public reports, and so on. So basically they brought together all this to kind of reconstruct the architecture and the urban design of the container terminal itself. So this is one thing interesting for me. I think as a researcher, the idea of access to space, the access to the factory space or the production space, and how much we can actually reach to it and research it and understand it and make that knowledge public. And I think this is a big problem coming up more and more, that we are unable to know more about these spaces. They are black boxes, politically, economically, technologically, innovation-wise, and so on. Yeah, we can open up this topic more. So,
Merveciğim, sorry for interruption. Can we slow down a little bit because translators hardly translate.
But I have, okay.
We have time. This is the last session, so we have time, enough time, if you have, for sure. Thank you.
We have 5 minutes. Well, I have 5 minutes for this part. So, okay, I will try to slow down. I'll do my best. The other examples of this research was, let's say, bringing together this truck. I mean, bringing this together, this research that is publicly available to reconstruct, as I said, the spatial scenarios of automation. So this is, for instance, one of the other scenes. So what then happens is you don't end up with a full, let's say, as you know, architects, designers, well, we see the master plan. We actually come to see a fragments of that master plan, which is, I think, also interesting in terms of a design thinking, which we can also discuss later on. So here, for instance, you see the entrance. The truck enters the port. And then another set of drawings then looks at the ergonomics of the working space. So one thing I have to say is in this case, for instance, when we say that the port is fully automated, it's actually not. So we have to also kind of question this language around automation and how far it brings this culture into the everyday life and to public opinion. So in fact, what happens is that the workers are not on site, but they are still managing these cranes, containers, movement within the container terminal, and so on. So what they do is they do it with a joystick from the office and not from the top of the container crane. So then what the research team at NEO Institute did in the case of Rotterdam is to look at the ergonomical condition that is created by, let's say, shifting the work from the top of the crane to the office space. And what you see here is the worker working in the crane top position to the office position. Okay, when we come to Pearl River Delta region, the idea was basically to look at, again, research and document the spaces of automation. And couple of things that kind of separate the two spaces, the two, let's say, contexts between each other is one, economies of scale. What I mean with economies of scale is that, for instance, I give you an example. The amount of budget that is incentivized by only the regional government of Pearl River, only the regional government of Guangdong for automation is 94 billion yuan, which is more than 10 billion euros. In 5 years for a plan of automation, the incentivization of the automation plan. This was a program that was called Robots Replacing Human Workers. And of course, as we know, like China works very much with 5-year plans, 10-year plans, and so on. And this is complemented with another 5 to 10-year plan by the by the national government. However, having said this, for instance, we also see a discrepancy. What we see is, for instance, in 2016, per 10,000 workers in mainland China, only 68 of them are robot workers. And then, but in South Korea, this number is 631. And in Germany, this number is 309. So what we see is that there's an incentivization, there's an aim plan on the government scale, but what we see from the bottom is not necessarily reaching to that or having the same ambition or the same goal for the future. But what we see is that anyone on any scale is trying to implement automation and smart automation, let's say. We will see a little bit later on this, in different levels. The reason for this is the fast worker turnover. The reason for this is the wages increasing. The reason for this is post-industrial condition, especially in Shenzhen, where we did the research. The reason for this is the still work is very much based on humans. There's an entire population that's ready to work, that wants to work, young population and so on. And I think this condition compares a lot to Turkey. So the factories don't necessarily, or the workshops, the ateliers don't necessarily want to automate for the sake of automating, but they want to benefit from the money that comes from the government. So what we see, for instance, in one case, this is like a one-man tailor who came in the 80s to Shenzhen and trying to implement automation in his own tailor shop. He is a tailor, he wants to improve his work and production line. So he's implementing some sort of automation in the case of, for instance, in this case, the human body is scanned. The scanned human body is transferred to a platform, to a digital platform. Through this digital platform, you can actually kind of go online and design your own clothing and then also print and then also send it to production. And as I'm saying, like one person operation. In another case, we see is an automated kitchen where we see especially community kitchens, public kitchens, school kitchens, or army kitchens becoming automated. And this way actually reaching out to, for instance, in the case of the army, it reaches out to inaccessible territories, or it is implemented in different let's say school buildings or community buildings and so on. So, and then in this case, for instance, what is imitated is the hand of the chef based on, let's say, 8 different cuisines in China. And what they are proud of is that they is this kind of imitation of the hand, of the human hand, which is again an interesting aspect to discuss. And then also then this card or the mobile station that moves on to different places, providing food in terrains that are not easily accessible. So here in this case, we are talking about agriculture, which was again, for instance, completely different than the implementation in the West. In Westland, in the Netherlands, for instance, what we saw was what was seen was a complete separation from the human work and the automated work. And then in China, where on the other hand, or in Pearl River Delta region where we researched, the aim was not necessarily to spare or to segregate the human and the machine. The aim in this case, for instance, to enable agriculture in higher terrain again, so that they don't need to build physical infrastructure such as roads, water networks, and so on, water infrastructure and so on. So, and then in the case of the factory, again, what I would say for sure, the aim is not necessarily to replace the human worker, because there is enough workers to kind of take the job if someone else wants to quit, or having a human worker is still more flexible in the production line, or still easier to for the lack of a better word and a bit of a cynical word, but utilize in the production line. And what we see in this case is that is very much that the human worker and the robot worker together sharing the same production line, working in the same conditions. Only in one case we saw actually this lights off factory, or the humans factory, which was a BYD. It was the factory where they produce batteries. It's actually the 5th biggest battery producing factory in the world. But what we saw, what was interesting, was like the human, for the human, there's actually only one zone. That is more on the outside. On the inside, there's a secondary zone where the engineer is following the process, and then there's a third zone where machines are doing all the production. And indeed, in this factory, what we saw basically was production, logistics, and storage being solved in the most efficient way, but within the same factory space, within the same shell of the factory. So they weren't necessarily building a new factory, they weren't necessarily designing a new factory, they were just taking one step ahead of what they were doing before. And what was easy in this case for them was that because it was a battery factory, they didn't necessarily have to articulate design of batteries each and every year, so the product is the most important aspect of it. If the product is not changing that much, it's also easier to automate that. Okay, so one last example I will mention in this case is another factory space, and maybe I will just stop it here because I'm already in 15 minutes. In this case, in this factory which produces mobile phone accessories, I want to take your attention here. Which is, again, this production space was not necessarily about, when we interviewed the factory owner and the management level, the aim wasn't necessarily, again, replacing the human workers, but to increase and to optimize the factory itself. To optimize in the case of, in the sense of production capacity, the amount of waste that is produced, the amount of energy sources that are used, and so on. And in relation to that, also the worker condition. And basically what they created was a kind of smart automation system, which would basically optimize the entire factory. And here on the screen, you see that smart automation system that is utilized as in the form of a mobile phone app or in the form of an application. So here what happens is, like you see here, the workers on this production line are not doing well. So you see a turtle appearing on the screen. So what is very cynical about this is that it actually reflects back the performance of the worker to the worker. So then you actually watch your own performance on the screen yourself. So it's a kind of 1984 scenario in a way. Well, in a way, in a different way. And in this case, for instance, it is used for showing the worker a certain task that is going to be done in the production line, used for packaging, maintenance, repair work, again, maintenance, storage space, the factory storage space that is about, let's say, this space I think was the most automated space that we saw within the factory, where basically everything was tagged with QR codes and everything would move, and then through these screens again we would watch. One would be able to watch what is moving where and how it is being distributed, how it is being shipped out, and so on. So everything comes with a tag, with a code that is scannable, manageable, registered, and so on. So it's the perfect scenario for control, not only for control of both humans and non-humans. But still, then it depends on your I guess perspective, approach, attitude, position, and where you want to look. So this is also what you see. The workers coming in with their lunch boxes and water bottles, and still making the factory space very much for themselves. So this is some views from the application that I was talking about that kind of relates to the smart automation, which basically relates all kinds of optimization processes together, that connects to stock exchange, to orders, to distributions, to cargo capacity, workers also, for instance, asking for holidays or asking for leave, asking for sick leave. The humidity and temperature levels in the factory in different places and so on. And what I want to emphasize again, and this maybe talks a little bit to Pier Vittorio Aureli, what he was talking about a couple of years ago, where the architecture or the urban design is very much about, let me see if I have other, the architecture or the urban design of the production space is very much based on a diagram of the production line. So you don't necessarily come up with a certain, it's not a formal aesthetics. It's not an understanding of formal aesthetics, but it's an aesthetics of the production line, which asserts itself more as a diagram of the space. So in this case, the question is like, how can these spaces be designed or planned? What should be the attitude towards that? And in this case, for instance, in this factory, again, what we see in terms of automation is very much sharing the heavy work, lifting boxes, moving things around between the production lines and so on. And what was interesting, and I want to really emphasize this several times, in Puerto Verdata region, unlike the Netherlands, accessing factories to research them was not a difficult one. Talking to people was not a difficult one, and learning from the production space was not a difficult one. So in this case, I think Turkey and China also relate to each other in several ways. Okay, so I'm going to skip all of these. We can come to them in discussion. And I'm gonna share just a few, like one example, and I'll try to keep it brief. So.
Still you have time, please take your time, because all of the information that you brought us are quite interesting, you know.
Glad to hear.
And original.
So, thank you. Well, okay, let me, wait. Okay, so so I was teaching, I started teaching in 2007 in Hong Kong University. So basically one thing that I should emphasize is the research in the factories in Puerto Verdata region was not necessarily from a certain disciplinary perspective. It was trying to understand the situation at hand, let's say from multiple perspectives, bringing together multiple scales and levels. And again, a matter of economies of scale, as I said, that everyone implements in different scales and levels. And this is very much enabled because of the ecosystem, because of it being Puerto Verdata region, a massive scale of space that is like a megalopolis, so to say. And then the second one, again, as I said, it's not necessarily about replacing the human workers. There is no labor shortage, or there is no incentive to, let's say, replace human workers from the bottom up. And that's not necessarily the aim. And then the third aspect, in this case, then, yeah, like how do we approach automation and work and the factory and the industry? And then the third aspect in this case, which I brought in with the HKU studio, and I have to say, like, it was in the landscape division, in the architecture school, in the landscape division. But again, I tried to actually do it pretty much interdisciplinary. So taking taking landscape as this kind of space where we bring together a lot of agency together, and trying to understand it from multiple scales, from the urban to the landscape to the architectural and so on. So I try to kind of keep it as free as possible in that sense. And then, so this brings me to my third point, which is something that we saw very much lacking in the case of Puerto Verdata region, was an understanding of the context. So where are these factories? How much do they have environmental impact? What kind of conditions do they create? Both, let's say, to the workers, which I kind of skipped to be quick, but then also to the environmental condition. How as if we keep talking about these spaces as if they are in the middle of nowhere, and as if they are not, you know, sitting on some rural or urban space and so on. So with the studio, I very much try to bring up this aspect of the ecology and the environment, as well as the social conditions. So in this case, as the studio site, with this kind of information, the idea was to look at, take this border, the border between Hong Kong and Shenzhen, as the site. So in 3 different years, we looked at we took as site different parts of this border. So one part was this Deep Bay, or Shenzhen Bay. This part of another year we looked at Lok Ma Chau Loop, and then another year we looked at Fanling area. Yeah, I mean, each of these sites come with very specific and special conditions. So just to show you a little bit what the students have done, and I'm going to show you only the Deep Bay scenario in this case, to show an example. So one idea was to look at the anthropocentric conditions, the conditions of land use, infrastructure, the implementations of government from top down, because sometimes they come up with these ideas and they just suspend all laws and regulations and they just do it. And then, you know, when we also take anthropocentric, we don't necessarily take it as a matter of higher governance, but also the human impact on the site level. So they looked at land use patterns, they looked at infrastructural implementations or interventions, they looked at border conditions, how the border conditions has changed between Shenzhen and Hong Kong, and again, all of this basically with respect to what do they mean in terms of a question of site research in relation to the studio brief. And again, land use pattern in smaller scale. Basically, this was a given site for the ones who want to focus more to the site conditions, trying to understand more what's happening on site from a material perspective, reclamation processes, oyster aquaculture is a very important source of economy in the Deep Bay area, especially on the Hong Kong side. Floating farms that people have built over time. Informal infrastructure that people built for water network that's needed for, let's say, oyster aquaculture and fishing. The waterfront condition, the liquid condition, let's say, between the water and the land, and what does that mean in terms of, let's say, again, infrastructure and land condition. Oyster farming history and how it relates to local culture. What happens over time. I'm going very fast now. And looking at it in different scales, the local scale, the regional scale, and the transnational scale, or the global scale, planetary scale, let's say. And really trying to understand, develop an understanding of the environment, of the ecology, of the context. This was basically what I was hammering all the time, because, yeah, I mean, how do we look at industry or production, not necessarily from a perspective of financial economy or production, or with a capacity of scale of production and creativity and so on. And then what you see more is trying to understand the environmental processes, and again, like bringing it to a regional scale. And they did the same analysis for the other parts of the site in the case of Lok Ma Chau Loop and others, and Fanling area. And I'm not going to get into this more now. So part of the brief was about, the starting point of the brief was the site the context, the urban-rural condition. And in this case, which is very important in the case of Shenzhen and Hong Kong, Shenzhen is highly developed, highly urbanized. Until the Shenzhen River, every piece is built and reclaimed and produced and manufactured and, you know, all the rest of it. While in Hong Kong side, very much stepping away from the border and living it natural and relating the economy and everyday life to that natural condition, to that ecological condition. So it was a bit of a challenge, an interesting challenge for the students to look at these two conditions at once and to kind of design, let's say, futures for those conditions. So that brings me to the brief, to the second aspect of the brief. I mean, the question of the studio was not necessarily to deal with an existing condition as such, for instance, the transformation of a certain space or, yeah, let's say, I mean, the idea was to kind of speculate a little bit, speculate on what these futures of a certain space could be. There is also a lot that comes from the politics of the border, of course, between Shenzhen and Hong Kong, which I'm not going into right now. And then the third aspect of the brief is the research and technologies, researching automation technologies, artificial intelligence technologies that relate very much to work, that relate very much to the relationship, to the communication, and to the consciousness among several agencies that produce a certain context that is about work, that is about production. But again, the idea was not necessarily to focus on production merely as a space of production, as a space of, let's say, industry in the way we understand like the production line and new objects, new consumption, you know, not like that, but like thinking of production as part of economy, as part of life, and how to, you know, in that sense, not necessarily be techno-pessimistic, but then also to try to confront the entanglements that come from the site in terms of what has been inherited and what has been projected in terms of the futures of this site, and to kind of come up with proposals of that. And I know I'm already out of time, so I'm going to show you just one example. And I think I need to stop and share again. So, so in this case, the DP example, and this project is by Liu Xiangru, and he looked at this whole periphery condition of the Bay Area and relating it to production and technologies. So he came up with a very strategic urban strategy proposal. Now I'm not sure if this is a good example, but okay. I will skip through all of these. These are all about the ecological and the future projections to the site. And for instance, yeah, let's talk about this. So he basically was proposing that the oyster farming would continue and the local economy would continue, and there would be incentives to protect the local economy and to use the oyster farming to redefine the border, the boundary condition. Or in another part of Lipe, so here basically he was proposing oyster farming to continue, but to introduce new technologies. And then on this part, he was proposing to actually build in such a way that these production facilities would be built over time. So it's very much, again, like emphasizing the ephemerality and the temporality, and build based on what is needed, taking one step further at a time and relating very much what is built to the context. And this way creating a kind of system that is talking to each other. And that is not necessarily based on a closed feedback, closed loop, but very much working with feedback between the environment and the human and the technology itself. In another case, he was very much taking the site condition, in this case, the bridge between Hong Kong and Shenzhen, and looking under what happens the bridge, and kind of again introducing technologies of producing brick, automated technologies of producing brick, where this brickwork, these bricks would come up from the oyster shells and would be created a new kind of reclamation scenario where we don't necessarily fill up the water, and to kind of, again, create a kind of negotiation on the border. Well, the whole idea was about a special nature reserve, basically. So he was trying to create this idea of special economic zone that is the factories, that is the production spaces within Pearl River Delta region, but he was very much implementing it to the idea of ecology and production and economy at the same time. Okay, because I can't stop myself, I will show you one, like one that is maybe more techno-optimistic. In this case, again, on the same site, Isaac Chong, he basically came up with an idea of environment and governance and implemented technology within that. And he kind of predicted 4 futures for the Deep Bay area, where the retro was about full gentrification and the entire Deep Bay becoming a tourist space. The Bay side was about a rural transformation, container park, Hong Kong, Deep Bay, Hong Kong side becoming completely a container terminal for the Shenzhen side, and Oyster Inn would be the production space for the oysters, so oyster industry, let's say. So he basically came up with the visual representations of these radical futures and tried to come up with an idea of a design goal that would create a kind of space where different, again, agencies, human and non-human, this includes oysters, machines, and humans, in the production process of oyster, in the oyster farming process as industry, and how to make it in a way that we don't give up the ecology, we don't give up the human presence, but we also kind of take in the technologies that are being developed, and how do we kind of create both of them, how do we create with all of these inputs. And really, again, like going one step at a time. So he actually started with producing these units for data collection, with drone towers, with the farm, the oyster farm, the nurturing of the oyster growing process, the transporter, how the oysters will be transported, how the oysters will be processed, how they will be recycled. Here, mainly I'm talking about the shell. And then what kind of space comes from that. And again, the understanding was really more about, again, thinking of a future scenario where, and this one is very much a speculative scenario, to imagine a kind of network, and this is my last sentence, I promise, thinking of a network of different users, and again, different agencies that are kind of infinitely bonded with each other. And let's say the decision-making process among them would be both communicative and based on consciousness. And this way, let's say the ecology wouldn't have to be given away, and the humans wouldn't have to be displaced, the people, the population at La Fashan and in Deep Bay. And also then we wouldn't necessarily produce oysters just to eat them. And also how the oysters will, let's say, how the production process can be better, and how, let's say, acknowledging that oysters are animals that we share the space with, and not necessarily something that we consume just like other human beings. With that, I stop, and I'm very sorry it's even 40 minutes.
No, thank you very much. We are just 4 minutes behind our schedule, and if Marie will excuse us, I would like to ask one question provided by one of our students, Sena Baran. Thank you for this stimulating presentation. What are your thoughts on the concept of displacement of workers instead of taking advantage of labor for only one task in terms of productivity and optimization? Would these optimized systems require more multitasking labor in near future? If yes, can you illustrate these workplaces? So I would like to stop in here because it's getting more complicated. even in that form, it's a hard question, I think.
Okay, so what I understand is, well, I mean, in the case of, for instance, the factory of mobile accessories, where we saw the smart automation in the form of an application, what is replaced is actually the middleman, or the person who knows more about the technological condition and the processing space, who is actually responsible from educating the unskilled laborer, and who is actually responsible to the boss. Who is, who is like the bridge between the boss and the unskilled laborer, unskilled worker. So this is the dystopian scenario of the condition. So it doesn't matter in the end if you're human or robot. You are seen as a capacity of production, whether skilled or unskilled, and this is what I would like to go against. And again, within this scenario of optimization, for instance, in this app, the only thing we don't see is the room of the boss. The only thing that we don't see in the app, that we can't control, manage, or foresee in the app is the room of the boss. So like the actual decisions being taken, where and how, this is the only thing we can't see. Or how much that app is being, how much that app kind of, the code of the app kind of manages the factory, or how much of it is manipulated by the decision maker is what we can't see. And this is the part that makes me, let's say, pessimistic in terms of implementation of accelerated technologies in the production space. So what if, again, the worker is not necessarily an unskilled one, and how with a certain awareness, self-consciousness, included still working, maybe blue-collar work, but bringing in the capacity and the creativity and the critical thinking to the production line itself, while still we, don't necessarily reject the idea of implementation of technology within the factory. So this is not something that I saw in the factories that we researched, but this is something that we tried to imagine within the design studio, for sure. And in this case, that's why, for instance, that student Isaac was thinking of this this system where, the oyster, the human worker, and environmental indicators, they're all connected to each other, and they kind of create a feedback loop where they kind of start each other's, initiate, let's say, or intervene or provoke each other's spaces of intervention. So let's say the work, if oyster is too much produced, then we stop that. Because producing too much oysters is also not good for the environment. It is maybe good for the workers because they will make more money, or the villagers because they will make more money, more economy, create more income. But here is how the feedback is supposed to be balanced. Again, it is a speculative scenario. It's an imagination of a future where maybe we can question capitalism and so on. So, there's all kinds of, thinking that needs to go around this. But it's not this question from Sena. It's not. I haven't seen it in the research, but I see it. But I can see different ways that it can actually happen, and that's what we were focusing on in the studio.
Thank you very much, Merve. I think we will invite you as a keynote for the next time, because you have both research and practice. So there will be more questions to discuss together in near future, hopefully. Thank you very much for your valuable contribution.
Thank you, Olgu.
Appreciate
I'm really sorry I took so much time. I apologize from Marie and also Olga from you for the next talks, but I will be here, so I'm listening the other talks. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.